last Rome lecture. The end of the short-lived Flavian dynasty, those are the folks who built the Colosseum, in 96 CE was followed by almost a century of stable and capable rule by the adoptive emperors, so called because each adopted his most promising subordinate as his successor. During this period, the population of Rome may have reached 500,000, making it the largest city in the world. The Roman provinces also flourished, and with prosperity came widespread acceptance of Roman rule, helped by the clear path to citizenship that the empire provided its most able citizens, whatever the land of their birth. By the way, that's a contrast with Greece. There were exceptions, of course. I've mentioned the Jewish rebellions, for example. It's also worth noting that while the urban elite enjoyed increasing prosperity, taxes, rents, and military service made life in the countryside less economically secure. On the other hand, slavery was increasingly replaced with tenant farming. None of these portrait busts is a required work, but looking at them together, what kind of image do you think these emperors were promoting? Well, the faces are stern and not entirely idealized, but neither do they reach the extremes of Republican verism. They are evoking ancient Greece, but tinged with a Roman sense of command. For the most part, the adoptive emperors were content just to maintain the territorial limits of the empire, but the notable exception was Trajan. He conquered the troublesome Dacians on the north shore of the Danube, and in 114 went to war with the Parthian Empire, which was Rome's rival to the east. He annexed Armenia in 114, northern Mesopotamia in 115, and occupied southern Mesopotamia all the way to the Persian Gulf in 116. You do not need to know those dates. But you should know that this was as large and powerful as the Roman Empire would get, and after this, the borders of the empire would slowly retreat. Within Rome, Trajan's biggest project was a forum that was twice the size of the forum that Augustus had built. Trajan's architect was Apollodorus of Damascus, who had been his chief military engineer during the Dacian campaign. At first, I was a little surprised that Trajan's Forum featured so heavily in the new curriculum. There are 4 College Board images associated with it, and they're all in your workbook. I've now decided that this choice makes a lot of sense, but before I explain that statement, let me ask you, why do you think the College Board might have chosen the entire Forum as one of the required works? What message did this complex send? Well, the massive public space sends the clear message that Rome is at the center of the military, commercial, and legal world, and that its emperor, Trajan, rules firmly but justly. The overall plan of the forum is not one of the required images, but it was included in your homework. So let's see how many parts you can identify both by name and function. Number 1 is the Temple of Trajan behind Trajan's column. Number 2, the temple was actually built by Trajan's successor, Hadrian. Roman emperors were now gods, a claim that would create problems for the small but growing number of Christians in the empire, who did not object to giving homage to emperors, but did object to giving homage to emperor gods. But what really strikes me is that the temple was not the centerpiece of the forum. Although only an inscription remains, and there's actually some dispute about where the temple was located, most archaeologists place it where it's shown on this plan, at the back of the forum, not even visible from the impressive gateway and courtyard. The really huge building, number 4, was the Basilica Ulpia. This was the major administrative building. It contained the law courts and administrative offices, basically the heartbeat of the empire. It seems to me that Trajan and his architect were signaling that just and efficient rule was the most important element of power and authority in Trajan's Rome, not really the emperor's godlike status. The big open space, 5, is the forum itself, surrounded by stoa, or covered colonnaded offices and shops. Remember, we saw those in the Agora, dominated by a statue of Hadrian on horseback. That's number 6. And number 3, the libraries, one for Greek texts, one for Latin, signaled that Rome was also the center of learning, the heir to the intellectual tradition of Athens, and a creative force in its own right. So this forum is all about power and authority in Rome. Here's a reconstruction of the Basilica Ulpia, again, the main administrative center of Trajan's Rome. Ulpia was Trajan's family name. The basilica is essentially a large rectangular room with a high interior ceiling and two semicircles at either end. These are called apses. Later, when the basilica was adapted by Christian churches, I hope that's the last of those arrows, the apse would appear at only one end and would hold the altar. In the Roman basilica, the apse also housed an altar, but it was where judges would sit during the legal proceedings. Sacrifices would be made on the altar just before these proceedings to invoke the gods' help and judgment. Another major difference between a Roman and Christian basilica is that the entrance to a church is on the short end of the rectangle on the wall opposite the apse, but one entered a Roman basilica on the long side. Built on a hill adjacent to the Forum was what is arguably the world's first giant shopping mall. One of the great accomplishments of Roman architecture was huge multi-story complexes, apartment houses as well as shopping centers. Note that, like the Colosseum, the massive scale of Trajan's market depended on arches and concrete. The basilica you just saw, by contrast, relied on more traditional post and lintel construction. So note that the complex included apartments as well as shops. Exedra, by the way, is another name for apse, that semicircular addition to a rectangular basilica. Here we get a look at the partly reconstructed indoor shopping area. The basic unit in the market was a taberna, a single-room shop covered by a barrel vault. Each taberna, Taberna, I should have labeled that, had a wide doorway, usually with a window above it. The shops were on several levels. They opened either onto the concave semicircular facade winding around the Forum's exedra, onto a paved street further up the hill, or onto a great indoor market hall. So again, the entrances and exits were very carefully planned. Excellent engineering. The ceiling was a concrete groin vault. Second floor shops were set back and then lit from skylights cut into those groin vaults. Remember that one of the huge advantages of concrete was that it permitted the architect to include windows without significantly weakening the structure. This was difficult with stone groin vaults. I've talked about how the arch was Rome's most important architectural innovation, along with concrete. But another characteristically Roman architectural work was the column. These columns were actually based in part on Egyptian obelisks. On the right, you see an obelisk from Luxor, which Napoleon brought back to Paris, where it stands today. You can see the similarity, but obviously there's a difference in shape and decoration. There is no statue on top of the obelisk. Instead, there's that pyramid top that, remember, had a religious significance to the Egyptians. The 128-foot-high column tells the story of Trajan's conquest of the Dacians. But what I find especially fascinating is that so many of the sculptures focus on Roman military engineering rather than on battles. Here's one example. As your reading pointed out, only about a quarter of the frieze is devoted to battle scenes. Oops. Here are some more scenes from the column. The photo makes it easier to see the spiral shape of the frieze. There are more than 2,500 figures on this column. And since the ancient Romans wouldn't have had a zoom function on their iPhones, they would not have been able to follow the story very easily, although the bright paint that once covered the frieze would have helped, as would the somewhat wider frieze registers toward the top. Note that the relief was quite low so that it did not obscure the general shape of the columns, but it was raised. It wasn't sunken as with columns in Egyptian art. Still, the work was pretty clearly designed to overwhelm as much as to inform. Don't mess with Trajan, don't mess with the Romans. Entryway into the Forum would have been through a triumphal arch, which is no longer standing. But here's another triumphal arch dedicated to Trajan in southern Italy along a new highway that Trajan constructed. Once again, this is a giant billboard advertising Trajan's greatness. So Trajan's successor was Hadrian, another emperor probably born in Spain. Hadrian loved all things Greek, and he deliberately imitated what he viewed as the style and appearance of a Greek philosopher. He would have welcomed the comparison to Pericles that we see here. This is an extraordinarily important work for this course. It was constructed during Hadrian's reign, and it's another work that's hard to do justice to with slides. The Pantheon was an engineering feat that reflected 300 years of experiment with concrete, including techniques for making lighter and lighter concrete at the upper levels of the dome. I really like this National Geographic introduction to the Pantheon, and you should feel free to watch the rest of the clip up on Moodle. Notice I did not, for once, assign the Khan Academy video on this work, but it might be worth watching. So take notes about the design of this work in your workbook, okay? Note especially what the video has to say about how form reinforces function, especially the example of the function of the oculus. This bird's eye view gives you a little better sense of the dome and the oculus, and also of the portico entrance. And here you see a diagram that shows the different kinds of concrete used at each level, as well as a reconstruction of the now missing Pantheon forecourt. And here we see the majestic interior, although the picture doesn't really do it justice. It's vast, and the multicolored marble, it really creates an incredible impression. Put it on your list. The coffers were not only an important element of decoration, they also significantly reduced the weight of the dome, another term you should know. And here are some more. Here are a couple of floor plans with terms that you should know. Rotunda, portico, that's the porch, oculus, that's the round hole, and coffered ceiling, which we just saw. So we're going to have to hurry away, and in fact, we're going to take a brief detour away from Rome, traveling east to Petra, in what today is Jordan. Petra was the capital city of the Nabatean kingdom. During Hellenistic and Roman times, Petra became a major caravan center, building its fortune on trade in frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, silks from China, and spices from India. As rulers of a commercial and cultural crossroads, the Nabateans tended to borrow many influences in their architecture. In other words, their culture, their religion, and their architecture were eclectic. So the area is now completely desert, but the Nabateans employed an ingenious water system that allowed the city to thrive. Some have called it the Las Vegas of the ancient world. Let's watch a couple of very short clips, parts of an interesting Nova documentary about Petra. As always, the whole video is up on Moodle. And yes, it is where a scene from the third Indiana Jones movie was filmed. If you have time, this clip gives a quick look at the scene. The entryway to the city, as you saw, is through a long, narrow canyon. It's almost a slot canyon. It's an amazing approach. I made it myself back in 2011 and would love to return to Petra. Put it on the list. By the way, my husband and I toured the whole area on donkey with the guide, but I forgot to ask him to pull up the photos. I look pretty silly. While this was nicknamed the treasury, this building is actually a tomb, almost certainly a royal tomb. Note that it's as much a sculpture as a building. This extraordinary monument was not built. It was carved into rock, like Mount Rushmore, although it is twice as large. Between the two outer columns, we see two figures on horseback. These represent Castor and Pollux. From Greek mythology, these are the twins who guided the souls of dead heroes to the Elysian fields, their special heaven. Within the porch, a room opens on either side before the main entrance, which was originally fitted with massive wooden doors. By the way, the inside of this is very simple. It's just cut wall. I probably should have included a photo of that. The pediment is crowned with a disc between horns surrounded by ears of wheat. These are all symbols of Isis, who is the Egyptian goddess of love and immortality, whom the Nabateans revered. So notice we have Greek and Egyptian gods. The upper story is where it gets really weird. It's a broken pediment interrupted by a tholus, a kind of small rotunda, again with Corinthian columns. Isis, in her role as the protector of the city, stands in the front bay of the tholus. Amazons, more Greek goddesses, are actually figures from Greek mythology, not goddesses, bearing axes, ornament the side bays of the tholos and the front and side bays of the broken pediment, while winged Nikes decorate the rear bays between the tholus and the pediments. And then eagles of Zeus crown the pediments. The tholus is topped by a symbolic funerary urn, which completes a decorative scheme that basically reinforces the symbolism of the death of a hero, the glory of his city, and a city that was perched between the cultures of Greece, Rome, and Egypt. So, what makes the style of the Petra treasury Hellenistic? Of course, the reference to all these different cultures and gods is itself Hellenistic, but what makes the style Hellenistic? Well, above all, it's eclectic. Again, that word means it draws on traditions from different parts of the late Greek Empire. So on the bottom, we see what looks like a traditional Greek temple with its Corinthian columns that identify it as a later Greek work. But notice that some of the columns are engaged. And what does that reflect? Etruscan and Roman temple design, also Egyptian temple design. Above this temple entryway, again, there's that second story with the split pediment and round tholos, and the tholos was an architectural style popular in Alexandria, Egypt, one of the major power centers of the Hellenistic world. On the right, you see an artist's reconstruction of the long since destroyed lighthouse at Alexandria, which was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Note that there's a tholos at top. The Hellenistic style of the building, with its split pediment and round tholos tombs is echoed in this second style painting, which is from a house in Pompeii. Art historians think the painting probably depicted Alexandria, not Petra. Sorry, my slides are misbehaving a little. Here we go. Here's another building that may be misnamed. Within the cella, or inner sanctuary room of the Great Temple, archaeologists have discovered a series of stone seats, which suggests that the structure was used not only as a temple, but at least at some period in its history served as an audience hall. There's a lower temenos, T-E-M-E-N-O-S, or holy area. We saw those in Greek and Etruscan temples. And then higher up is an upper temenos that contained the temple proper. By the way, there's another theory about this building, and since the new College Board exam seems to love current theories, and that's that this was the center of a vast system designed to channel water from nearby hills. So let's watch a short video clip, same Nova documentary, that shows the Great Temple and describes its water channels, or at least the discovery of the water channels. And if you'd kept watching the video, you'd seen this imaginative reconstruction of the temple complex with its water pools. Okay, back to Rome. Now the maps begin to shrink. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, pulled the frontier back to the Euphrates. The latest phase of the Pax Romana lasted until Marcus Aurelius broke from tradition and named his son Commodus emperor instead of adopting somebody who seemed like he'd make a good emperor, and Commodus in fact proved to be a really lousy emperor. The Pax Romana began to decay. In the half century after 235, there were 15 emperors, and most of them were generals who only ruled for a few years before they were killed or overthrown, usually by their own troops. And these were the so-called soldier emperors. Meanwhile, Rome's enemies were becoming more powerful. In the east, the Parthians had been replaced by the Sassanid Persians, who sought to restore the glory of the Persian Empire by pushing Rome out of the east, and they were mostly able to do that. In the west, the Germans began to raid deep into the empire, reaching the Mediterranean at several points. Okay, this isn't a required work, but this portrait bust of one of the so-called soldier emperors, Trajan Decius, again signals a return to the veristic style, but even more, I think it captures the political turmoil and anxiety of the late Roman Empire. This is a much less triumphant emperor than the ones we saw at the beginning of this lecture. Okay, I'm running out of time, and you saw an excellent podcast describing this work, so I'll just hit a few points in review, but let me make a point here. I can't cover everything in my lectures. It's very important that you also do the homework. You could get 8 questions on the AP exam on this work, and if you hadn't done the homework, I'm not going to give you enough information now to do well on that. Anyway, to move on, we note that the composition of this work is chaotic. It was not intended to capture an orderly procession or a victory march. Yes, the Romans are winning against the barbarians, but it no longer seems as if they always win. Once again, too, the figures float in space. The ground line and sense of perspective has disappeared. The bodies are also disproportionate. The heads are too large. But it's a mistake to assume that Roman sculptors had simply lost the skill for creating more realistic images. This work almost certainly reflects a conscious rejection of the calm classicism of Roman art, just as the Hellenistic Greeks rejected the calm classicism of early Greek art. But it's hard not to believe that this reflected in part a greater uncertainty and anxiety in the face of the empire's decline. Another sign of change is the symbol on the young commander's forehead. It seems to indicate that he has embraced one of the Eastern mystery religions, the worship of Mithras. As Rome faced increasing dangers both within and without, more and more Romans found the old gods inadequate for their spiritual needs. One of the new religions from the East was, of course, Christianity. And this brings us to the end of our unit on Greece and Rome. We're going to return to late Empire Rome in Unit 6 when we take up the story of Christianity. But first, we're going to explore the art of three other great religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and then look at the art of Africa and the Pacific.